If you've gotten into photography, then you have perhaps played around with DSLRs. Chances are you're connected to a few others like you who also love photography. Have you heard from other photo enthusiasts about the importance of using the manual mode? So, do you feel if you don't use the manual mode, you're not as good a photographer as someone else is? In this video, let's understand the manual mode a little better and perhaps why one should not always use the manual mode. Hello folks, I am Jayant Sharma, and in this video we call the nugget, let's demystify the dreaded manual mode and understand why one should use it, and most importantly, why I don't think it's a mode to be deployed all the time. But before that, please make sure you're subscribed to this channel and you've also told YouTube to notify you when updates to this channel happen, for which you need to ring a bell below. Before we question the famous manual mode, let's quickly understand what it means to be deploying it. What should a photographer do after switching to the manual mode? Do you think a good photographer just keeps whatever aperture, shutter and ISO values he or she thinks is required based on gut feel and experience? Absolutely no. If you are one such photographer who is busy doing guesswork, you're more interested in a game called Guess the Exposure than photographing something interesting. You can play that game if you like, but photographers don't need to guesswork or depend on their experience only. In fact, they have to learn to talk to the camera and listen to the camera, which is talking all the time to them. Irrespective of whatever metering mode is enabled, the camera is always measuring light. Depending on what metering mode, it measures light differently. So one has to either start by fixing the aperture, shutter speed and ISO, and then by listening to the camera's meter, which is suggesting how underexposed or overexposed the present settings are. Gradually, one has to make compensations to either the shutter speed or aperture or ISO and ensure the metering scale suggests the exposure is correct by aligning with the 0 on the scale. If the scale showed the bar towards the positive side, it's going to be overexposed, and vice versa if it leaned towards the negative side. Now, it takes a bit of presence of mind and figuring out what to change between the three values of the exposure triangle to bring the scale to 0. For instance, I always stick to an aperture and ISO and then will only adjust the shutter to bring the scale to 0. Someone else may stick to a shutter speed value of, let's say, 1/500th of a second and then adjust the aperture to bring the scale to 0. If you notice, it's time consuming. But hey, that's exactly how manual mode is used. So now that we have put aside the understanding of how manual mode works, shall we discuss why should we take this route? When you question some manual mode fans, they say we have complete control, that's why we use it. Okay, fair enough, but why do we need complete control? Are we control freaks? Well, if you question a bit in detail, you will realize they want to make changes to the camera's suggestion of what the optimal exposure by either underexposing or overexposing the shot. Now that makes sense. So let's say the camera said at f4 and ISO 400, 1/100th is the perfect exposure. But the shot ended up making the subject a bit too dark and the photographer wants to add more light now. So they changed the shutter from 1/80 to 1/60th of a second, thereby overexposing the shot by 1/3 or 2/3 stops of light from 1/100th of a second. Great. If you think about it, these photographers came to 1/100th of a second after making changes to the shutter to match it at 0, which the camera said is the right exposure. That must have taken a few seconds at least. Now, they took a shot to realize they need to add more light. And that's why they love the manual mode, because they can simply overexpose or underexpose or override the camera's settings. Makes sense. However, this can be done in half the time while on aperture priority mode itself, for instance, by simply pointing the camera at f4 and ISO 400 at the subject where it would definitely adjust the shutter speed to 1/100th of a second as the shutter, and then by quickly using exposure compensation dial, one can underexpose or overexpose as desired, thus making the whole process faster. So you agree, controlling exposure by overriding what the camera suggests can be done faster in aperture priority or shutter priority mode by not even missing an opportunity like in sports and wildlife photography where timing is vital. In fact, if you haven't noticed, pro bodies like the Canon 1DX Mark II or the Nikon D5 don't have the auto mode, which suggests it is not expected to use such camera bodies in auto mode. After all, they are made for professional users, or let's say users with a good know-how. However, at the same time, it doesn't mean users with good know-how need to use manual mode all the time. In fact, there could be many use cases while the manual mode is crucial. Let me list a few of them. Number one, when using additional lights like strobes, flash guns, etc., manual mode is a necessity. I use a lot of manual mode in underwater photography, again because of the use of external strobes where I need to keep the sync speed or the synchronization speed of the camera in mind. Sync speed is the max shutter speed I can use to accommodate flash. In most Canon cameras, it's 1/250th of a second, while in Nikon, it could be 1/320th of a second as well. Let's have a look at this image of the macaws I shot in the Pantanal on our Jaguar photography expedition. Here, I wanted a black dark background for the macaws in flight, so I actually metered the rocks away, set the appropriate exposure, and came back to this scene to reuse the exposure of the rocks which are no longer in my scene. So let's say by using manual mode, I fixed the 3 exposure parameters by not allowing the camera to measure light in the scene and set something else than what the camera is desiring here. Likewise, the reasons can be specific and many like what we have just discussed. But that doesn't mean we use the manual mode for every single picture. There's no peer pressure here to show others we understand photography better. Let me give you an analogy. Let's say as a mechanic, we have a screwdriver, spanner, and a hammer. Each of these tools has a specific usage, and a good mechanic doesn't say he always uses the hammer or the screwdriver. He uses each of these tools for what it's made for. Likewise, I think it's smart to use all the mode like aperture priority, shutter priority, and even manual mode appropriately depending on what the situation is like. I'll be happy to share some ideas on how I use each of these modes specifically. Meanwhile, can I ask you to let me know what your usage of the manual mode is? Do you love using the manual mode with auto ISO maybe? Or do you think aperture priority does most of your job? Whatever it is, let us know and I'll be happy to interact.